I woke up to someone knocking on my door. The sound cut through the constant hum of the rig's machinery that I'd gotten used to after 3 months working down here. I rolled over and checked my watch. 2:37 in the morning. Who the hell was bothering me at this hour? The knocking came again. 3 slow raps that echoed in my small quarters. I groaned and swung my legs out of bed, my feet hitting the cold metal floor. Working as a marine biologist on this deep-sea oil rig 1,500 feet underwater meant dealing with all kinds of weird schedules, but this was pushing it. Yeah, I'm coming," I muttered, pulling on a t-shirt over my boxers. The crew was always pulling pranks on each other. Last week, someone had rigged Jeremy's alarm clock to go off every hour. The week before that, they'd filled my diving gear with shaving cream. It was how we dealt with being stuck in this metal tube under all that water. You either laughed or went crazy. This had to be another joke, probably something to do with the captain, that stupid story everyone loved telling new guys. According to the old-timers, some phantom figure wandered the rig at night, checking on things. Complete bullshit, but it made for good ghost stories during the long shifts. I shuffled to the door and grabbed the handle. "This better be good, Jeremy," I called out, figuring it was my buddy trying to get me back for the time I'd short-sheeted his bunk. I pulled the door open, ready to give whoever it was a piece of my mind. A tall man stood in the hallway, staring right at me. He had a thick, dark beard streaked with gray and wore a yellow rain jacket that looked like it had seen better days. Water dripped steadily from his clothes onto the floor, forming a small puddle at his feet. I'd never seen this guy before in my life. Can I help you?" I asked, suddenly very awake. The rig only had a crew of 12, and I knew every single person on board. This wasn't one of them. The man didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with these dark eyes that seemed to look right through me. His face was pale, almost gray in the fluorescent lighting of the corridor. The water kept dripping from his jacket. Drip, 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 hitting the metal floor with tiny splashes. "Hey, are you okay?" I tried again, stepping closer to the doorway. "Are you hurt?" Still nothing. The guy stood there like a statue, not even blinking. His breathing was so quiet I couldn't tell if he was breathing at all. The smell of seawater filled the hallway, strong and briny like we were standing on a beach instead of deep underwater. I looked past him down the corridor, expecting to see Jeremy or one of the other guys hiding around the corner, trying not to laugh. But the hallway was empty, just the usual white walls and overhead lights stretching in both directions. "Look, I don't know who you are or how you got on this rig, but..." The man turned around without warning and started walking away. His boots made wet, squelching sounds against the floor with each step. I watched him move down the hallway with this weird, steady pace. Not fast, not slow, just constant. "Hey, wait!" I called after him, but he didn't stop or look back. I stepped out into the corridor, the cold metal biting into my bare feet. The man reached the corner where the hallway turned toward the equipment bay and disappeared around it. I hurried after him, my feet slapping against the floor. When I got to the corner and looked around it, the hallway was empty. No sign of the guy anywhere. I walked a few more steps, checking the side passages and storage rooms, but found nothing. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The rig was sealed tight. You couldn't get on or off without going through the main airlock, and that required clearance codes that only the crew had. Security cameras monitored every entrance. There was no way some random guy in a rain jacket could just show up. But I'd seen him, clear as day. The water on the floor was real too. I could see the wet footprints leading from my door to where they stopped at the corner. I walked back to my quarters, my mind racing. Maybe it was one of the crew in a disguise, some elaborate prank they'd been planning for weeks. But the guy had been too tall to be Jeremy, and his build was all wrong for any of the other guys I worked with. I got back to my door and looked down at the puddle of water. It was bigger now, spreading across the floor in an uneven circle. I knelt down and touched it with my finger. Cold, salty, definitely seawater. My stomach started to feel weird. We were 1,500 feet underwater, surrounded by millions of gallons of ocean. If seawater was somehow getting inside the rig, that was a serious problem. But the water wasn't coming from any visible leak. It had been dripping off that man's clothes. I went back into my room and grabbed a towel from my small bathroom. When I came back out, the water was gone. The floor was completely dry, like nothing had happened. Even the wet footprints had disappeared. I stood there holding the towel, staring at the empty hallway. My hands were shaking a little, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. This wasn't a prank. I knew every person on this crew, and that man wasn't one of them. He'd been too real, too solid to be some kind of hallucination. But he'd also vanished without a trace, leaving behind water that had somehow dried up in minutes. I thought about the stories the crew told about the captain, always described as a tall man with a beard, wearing old-fashioned rain gear. Someone who died years ago but still walked the rig at night, checking on things, making sure everything was running smoothly. I'd always laughed at those stories, ghost tales to spook the new guys. But standing there in that empty hallway, I wasn't laughing anymore. I needed to find Jeremy. After what I'd just seen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong on the rig. The whole encounter with that bearded guy had left me rattled, and I needed to talk to someone who'd believe me. I threw on my work clothes and headed down the corridor toward the equipment bay. Jeremy usually hung out there during his breaks, tinkering with gear or just shooting the breeze with whoever was around. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I walked, casting everything in that familiar harsh white glow that made the metal walls look even more sterile than usual. The equipment bay was a large room filled with diving gear, maintenance tools, and spare parts for the rig's various systems. Rows of metal shelving lined the walls, packed with everything from oxygen tanks to welding equipment. The smell of oil and metal hung in the air, mixed with the faint scent of rubber from the diving suits. I found Jeremy near the back of the room, checking over some diving equipment. He looked up when I walked in, his green eyes catching the light. His reddish-brown hair was a bit messy, like he'd been running his hands through it. "David, hey," he said, setting down a regulator he'd been examining. "You look like hell. Everything okay?" I walked over to him, glancing around to make sure we were alone. A couple of other crew members were at the far end of the bay, but they were deep in conversation about some maintenance issue. "Jeremy, I need to tell you something," I said, keeping my voice low. "About 20 minutes ago, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, there was this guy standing there, tall, dark beard with gray streaks, wearing a yellow rain jacket. He was soaking wet, like he'd just come in from outside." Jeremy's expression shifted from casual interest to something more serious. He set the regulator down completely and turned to face me. "What did he say?" Jeremy asked. "That's the thing. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, then walked away. I followed him, but he disappeared around the corner near the storage rooms. When I got there, he was gone." Jeremy was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful. He had this habit of checking his watch when he was thinking, and sure enough, he glanced down at his wrist. "David," he said slowly, "what time did this happen?" "Around 2:45, maybe 2:50. Jeremy's face went pale. Jesus Christ. What? I saw him too. Jeremy's voice dropped to almost a whisper. About an hour ago, maybe a little more. I was doing my rounds in Section C checking the pressure gauges when I saw this guy at the end of the hallway. Tall, bearded, wearing that same yellow jacket you described. My stomach dropped. You're serious? Dead serious. I called out to him, asked if he needed help, but he just turned and walked away. I went after him, but when I got to where he'd been standing, there was nobody there. Just wet footprints on the floor. We stared at each other for a moment. The implications were sinking in fast. This isn't a prank, I said. No way, Jeremy agreed. Nobody could coordinate something like this. And besides, how would they get that much seawater up here? The footprints I saw were soaking wet, just like you described. I ran my hand through my hair, trying to think. We need to tell the others. If there's really someone on the rig who shouldn't be here, that's a serious security issue. Jeremy nodded. Yeah, we should alert the crew. Get everyone together and do a proper search. We left the equipment bay and started making our way through the rig, gathering up the other crew members. It didn't take long. There were only 8 of us on the night shift, and most were either in the control room or the mess hall. Within 15 minutes, we had everyone assembled in the main corridor. Jeremy and I explained what we'd seen, describing the bearded man in detail. The reactions were mixed. Some of the guys looked skeptical, others seemed genuinely concerned. You sure it wasn't Rodriguez from the day shift? Asked Martinez, one of the maintenance guys. He's got a beard, and sometimes people stick around late. Rodriguez doesn't have gray in his beard, Jeremy said, and he's not nearly as tall as this guy was. Plus, Rodriguez would have answered when we called to him, I added. This guy didn't say a word. Thompson, the senior crew member on duty, took charge. All right, let's do this systematically. We'll split into pairs and search every section of the rig. Check all the rooms, storage areas, everything. If there's someone here who shouldn't be, we'll find them. We divided up into teams of 2 and spread out across the platform. Jeremy and I took the lower sections, while the other pairs covered the upper levels, the control areas, and the outer sections of the rig. The search took over an hour. We went through every room, every storage closet, every maintenance area. We checked the diving chambers, the equipment lockers, even the spaces between the walls where pipes and cables ran. Jeremy and I covered our assigned sections methodically, calling out to each other as we cleared each area. Anything in the pump room? I called to Jeremy as I finished checking a storage area filled with spare parts. Nothing, he called back. Just the usual equipment. We met up with the other teams back in the main corridor. One by one, they reported the same thing. No sign of anyone who shouldn't be there. What about the access points? Thompson asked. All the hatches, the diving platform, the supply lift? Check them all, said Williams, who'd been paired with Martinez. Everything's secure. No signs of forced entry. No indication anyone's been messing with the locks. Thompson scratched his head. That doesn't make sense. If someone's on the rig, they had to get here somehow. Maybe they're hiding in a section we missed, suggested one of the other crew members. We covered everything, Jeremy said. Every room, every storage area. If there was someone here, we would have found them. The group stood there in the corridor, looking puzzled. I could see the doubt starting to creep into their faces. Without any physical evidence, our story was starting to sound less credible. Look, Thompson said finally. Maybe you guys saw something. Maybe you didn't. But we've searched the entire platform and found nothing. All the access points are secure. I'm not sure what else we can do. We know what we saw, I said. But even as I said it, I could hear how it sounded. "I'm not saying you're lying," Thompson replied. "But sometimes, especially on the night shift, your eyes can play tricks on you. The lighting down here, the shadows, the stress of being underwater for weeks at a time, it can mess with your head." Jeremy and I exchanged glances. I could see he was as frustrated as I was, but what could we say? We'd searched everywhere and found nothing. The group started to disperse, crew members heading back to their stations or their quarters. Thompson lingered for a moment. "If you see anything else, let me know immediately," he said. "But for now, I'm going to log this as a possible false alarm. We can't have the whole crew on edge over something we can't verify." After Thompson left, Jeremy and I stood alone in the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the constant thrum of the rig's machinery. "They think we're seeing things," Jeremy said. "Yeah, I got that impression too." "But we both saw him, David. Same description, same time frame. That's not a coincidence." I nodded, but doubt was starting to creep in. The complete lack of any physical evidence was hard to ignore. No footprints, no wet spots, no sign that anyone had been where we'd seen them. "Maybe we should check the security footage," I suggested. "There are cameras throughout the rig. If this guy was really here, he would have been caught on tape." Jeremy's face brightened. "That's a good idea. The security office should have recordings from tonight." We made our way to the small security office near the control room. The door was unlocked, and inside we found a bank of monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the rig. A digital recording system stored footage from all the cameras. I sat down at the console and started pulling up the recordings from earlier that night. The timestamp showed it was now 4:37 in the morning. I rewound the footage to around 2:30 and started scanning through the feeds. "There," Jeremy said, pointing at one of the monitors. "That's the corridor outside your room." I focused on that camera feed and watched the recording. At 2:37, I could see myself opening my door and stepping into the hallway. I watched myself look around, then start walking down the corridor. But there was no one else visible in the frame. "That's impossible," I muttered. He was right there. I switched to other camera angles, checking the feeds from the corridors where Jeremy had seen the figure. Again, the recording showed Jeremy moving through the areas, but no sign of anyone else. We spent another 30 minutes going through footage from every camera on the rig, covering the entire time period when we'd had our encounters. The recordings clearly showed both of us moving around, searching, talking to each other, but there was no trace of the bearded man in the yellow rain jacket. Jeremy slumped back in his chair. "This doesn't make any sense." I stared at the monitors, watching the playback of myself following someone who apparently wasn't there. The evidence was right in front of me, but it contradicted everything I knew I'd experienced. The security footage showed us searching empty corridors, talking to air, following shadows that didn't exist. I walked into the security office around 8 in the morning, my head still fuzzy from the restless night. The small room hummed with the sound of cooling fans from the bank of monitors that lined one wall. Jeremy was already there, sitting in front of the main console with a cup of coffee steaming next to him. "Any luck getting into the system?" I asked, pulling up a chair beside him. "Yeah, took me a while to remember Thompson's password, but I'm in." Jeremy clicked through several menu screens. "I've got access to all the cameras from last night." The monitors showed a grid of different camera feeds from around the rig. I could see the main corridors, the equipment bay, the mess hall, even the exterior platforms. Everything looked normal in the daylight feeds, just the usual activity of the day shift going about their work. "Let's start with the hallway outside my quarters," I said. That's where I first saw him. Jeremy navigated to the camera that covered my section of the corridor. The timestamp showed 2:30 in the morning. We watched the empty hallway for several minutes. Nothing happened. The corridor remained completely vacant. Fast forward a bit, I suggested. Jeremy sped up the playback. At 2:37, my door opened and I stepped out into the hallway, wearing just a t-shirt and boxers. On the monitor, I looked around the empty corridor, then walked toward the corner where the hallway turned. There, I pointed at the screen. That's when I was following him. But look, there's nobody there. The footage showed me walking alone down the corridor, stopping at the corner, then returning to my quarters. No bearded man, no yellow rain jacket. Just me, apparently talking to myself and following nothing. "That's weird," Jeremy muttered. "Let me check the camera that covers the equipment bay." He switched to a different feed and found the timestamp for when Jeremy had been doing his rounds. The footage showed Jeremy walking through the equipment bay, checking various pieces of gear. He paused near the diving equipment, looked around as if he'd seen something, then continued his inspection. "I swear I saw him right there," Jeremy said, pointing at an empty space on the monitor. He was standing by the air compressor, just watching me. We spent the next 2 hours going through every camera feed from the previous night. We checked the corridors, the equipment areas, the mess hall, even the exterior cameras that monitored the platform decks. The footage showed our normal routines, Jeremy doing his rounds, me getting up to investigate the knocking, both of us later gathering the crew for the search. But there was no bearded man anywhere in any of the recordings. "This doesn't make sense," I said, rubbing my eyes. "We both saw him. We described the same person." "Maybe the cameras malfunctioned," Jeremy suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "All of them? At the same time?" I shook my head. "The system records everything automatically. If there was a malfunction, there'd be error logs." Jeremy checked the system diagnostics. Everything showed normal operation throughout the night. No glitches, no missing footage, no technical problems. By the time we finished reviewing the recordings, word had spread through the rig about what we'd found, or rather, what we hadn't found. Thompson stopped by the security office around 10:30. "So, no mystery man on the cameras?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Nothing," Jeremy confirmed. "The footage shows us doing exactly what we said we were doing, but there's no sign of anyone else." Thompson nodded slowly. "Look, I'm not saying you guys are lying, but working down here can mess with your head sometimes. The isolation, the weird lighting, being underwater for weeks at a time. Maybe you both just had the same kind of stress reaction." After Thompson left, Jeremy and I sat in silence for a while. The security monitors continued their endless cycle, showing the normal daytime activity around the rig. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. "Do you think he's right?" Jeremy asked finally. "About the stress?" I wanted to say no immediately, but doubt was creeping in. The footage was pretty clear evidence that whatever we'd seen hadn't actually been there, at least not in any way the cameras could detect. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know what I saw. That man was real. He was standing right outside my door dripping wet." "Yeah, and I saw him too. Same description, same everything." Jeremy paused. "But if the cameras didn't catch him..." The rest of the day, shift crew gradually learned about our failed search through the security footage. I could see the skepticism in their faces when they looked at us. A few guys made jokes about ghost hunting and seeing things. Most of them were polite enough not to say anything directly. But the message was clear. They thought we'd imagined the whole thing. By afternoon, I was starting to question myself. I'd been working on the rig for 3 months straight without a break. The constant artificial lighting, the recycled air, the isolation from the surface world. Maybe it was getting to me more than I'd realized. I found myself replaying the encounter over and over in my mind, trying to remember every detail. The man's beard, streaked with gray. The yellow rain jacket, old and worn. The smell of seawater. The sound of his footsteps, wet and squelching on the metal floor. It had all seemed so real, more real than anything else that had happened that night. But the cameras didn't lie. They showed exactly what had occurred, and according to them, Jeremy and I had been alone in those corridors. No mysterious visitor, no bearded man in a rain jacket. Jeremy and I barely spoke during the evening meal. We sat at our usual table in the mess hall, picking at our food, while the conversation flowed around us. I caught a few of the other guys glancing our way, probably wondering if we were going to start seeing things again. After dinner, I went back to my quarters and lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling. The steady hum of the rig's machinery filled the silence, the same sound that had been interrupted by that knocking the night before. Had I really heard knocking? Or had I just woken up naturally and imagined it? The more I thought about it, the less certain I became about any of it. Maybe Thompson was right. Maybe the isolation and stress of working 1,500 feet underwater had finally caught up with me. Maybe my mind had created the bearded man as some kind of release valve for the pressure. But if that was true, how had Jeremy seen the exact same thing? I rolled over and checked the time on my watch. 9:45 in the evening. In a few hours, it would be time for the night shift again. Jeremy and I would be back on duty, walking the same corridors where we'd seen, or thought we'd seen, the mysterious figure. The thought made my stomach tighten with anxiety. Not because I was afraid of seeing the man again, but because I was afraid I wouldn't. If he didn't appear tonight, it would confirm that the whole thing had been some kind of shared hallucination brought on by the stress of our work environment. And if he did appear, well, that might be even worse, because it would mean the cameras had somehow failed to record something that was definitely there, which didn't make any logical sense. I closed my eyes and tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept circling back. The bearded man, the yellow rain jacket, the smell of seawater, the wet footprints that had vanished. All of it felt real in my memory, but the security footage suggested otherwise. The doubt gnawed at me as I lay there in the artificial twilight of my quarters, listening to the endless mechanical heartbeat of the rig. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, my mind racing through everything that had happened. The bearded man's face kept flashing in my head, those dark eyes staring right through me, the water dripping from his yellow jacket onto the floor. I'd replay the whole thing over and over, trying to make sense of it. Jeremy had seen him too. That part wasn't in my imagination, but the cameras showed nothing. How was that even possible? Thompson's explanation about stress and isolation made logical sense, but it felt wrong. I knew what I'd seen. I checked my watch. 1:15 in the morning. The rig hummed around me like always, that constant background noise of machinery and ventilation that you got used to after a while. Usually it helped me sleep, but tonight it just reminded me I was 1,500 feet underwater in a metal tube, and something was down here with us that shouldn't exist. My eyes finally got heavy around 2 in the morning. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. That same sound that had woken me up the night before. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, with that wet, squelching noise. I sat up fast, my heart already pounding. Part of me wanted to stay in bed, pull the covers over my head and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I had to know. I had to see if he was really there. I slipped out of bed and crept to the door. My hand shook a little as I turned the handle as quietly as I could. I opened it just a crack and peered out into the hallway. There he was. The same tall figure in the yellow rain jacket, standing at the far end of the corridor near the junction that led to the equipment bay. He wasn't looking in my direction. He was facing away from me, toward the other end of the rig. Water dripped steadily from his clothes onto the metal floor, making little puddles around his feet. I held my breath and watched him. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds, completely still except for the water dripping off him. Then he started walking. His movements were slow and purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. Each step made that same wet sound I'd heard before. He turned the corner and disappeared from view. I didn't even think about it. I stepped out into the hallway in my bare feet and followed him. The metal floor was freezing cold against my skin, but I barely noticed. I moved as quietly as I could, staying close to the wall. When I reached the corner where he'd turned, I peered around it carefully. He was about 50 feet ahead of me, walking down the main corridor that ran through the center of the rig. His pace was steady, but not rushed. I waited until he was almost at the next junction before I started following again. I kept my distance, ducking behind support beams and equipment whenever I thought he might turn around, but he never looked back. He just kept walking, leaving that trail of water behind him. We passed through the mess hall area, then down another corridor I didn't recognize as well. The rig was bigger than most people realized. There were sections I rarely went to during my normal shifts. He seemed to know his way around perfectly, never hesitating at intersections or stopping to get his bearings. The further we went, the more the layout started to change. The corridors got narrower, and there were more pipes running along the walls and ceiling. We were heading toward the lower levels, down into the guts of the rig where the heavy machinery was housed. I'd only been down here a few times during my 3 months on the rig. It wasn't part of my usual duties as a marine biologist. This was where the engineers and maintenance crews worked, keeping the massive systems running that powered everything above. The bearded man turned down a stairwell I'd never seen before. It was narrow and steep, with metal grating for steps. I waited at the top until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, then started down after him. The air got warmer as I descended. I could hear the rumble of engines getting louder with each step. By the time I reached the bottom, the sound was almost overwhelming, a constant thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the metal walls and floor. I found myself in a corridor lined with thick pipes and electrical conduits. Steam hissed from joints in the piping, and the air smelled like oil and hot metal. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim red glow. The bearded man was maybe 20 feet ahead of me, still walking with that same steady pace. He turned another corner, and I hurried to catch up, not wanting to lose him in this maze of machinery. When I rounded the corner, I saw him approaching a heavy metal door marked with warning signs about authorized personnel only. He walked right through it like it wasn't even there. I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was solid steel, and I'd watched him pass through it like it was made of air. My hands started shaking as the reality of what I was seeing finally hit me. This wasn't a person. This wasn't someone who'd somehow gotten onto the rig without being detected. This was something else entirely. I approached the door slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The handle turned easily when I tried it. It wasn't locked. I pulled it open and stepped through into the engine room. The noise was deafening in here. Massive diesel engines lined the walls, their pistons pumping in a rhythm that shook the entire room. The air was thick with heat and the smell of burning fuel. Banks of gauges and control panels monitored every aspect of the operation. I scanned the room, looking for any sign of the bearded man. The space was huge, filled with machinery that created dozens of hiding spots. Steam and shadows made it hard to see clearly. Then I spotted movement near the main engine assembly. Someone was standing there, but it wasn't the bearded man. It was Jeremy. I followed the bearded man down the narrow stairwell, my bare feet silent on the metal steps. The air got warmer with each step, and the sound of the engines grew louder until it was almost deafening. I kept my distance, staying about 20 feet behind him as we descended deeper into the rig. The stairwell was steep and cramped, with pipes running along both walls. I had to duck under a few low-hanging conduits, and the whole place smelled like diesel fuel and hot metal. The bearded man moved with that same steady pace, never looking back, never hesitating. His yellow rain jacket was still dripping, leaving a trail of water on the steps. When we reached the bottom, I found myself in a corridor I'd never seen before. It was lined with massive pipes and electrical conduits, all humming and vibrating from the machinery beyond. The noise was incredible down here, a constant roar that made my ears ring. I pressed myself against the wall and watched as the bearded man continued forward. He walked about 50 feet down the corridor before stopping at a heavy metal door. Warning signs covered it, authorized personnel only, and danger, high voltage, in bright red letters. I expected him to open it, but instead he just walked straight through it, like it wasn't even there. My blood went cold. I stood there staring at the door, trying to process what I'd just seen. The man had passed through solid steel like it was made of air. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. I waited a full minute before approaching the door myself. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked. I pulled it open and stepped into the engine room. The noise hit me like a physical force. 3 massive diesel engines dominated the space, each one the size of a small building. They thundered and roared, powering the generators that kept the rig running. The air was thick with heat and the smell of burning fuel. Gauges and control panels lined the walls, their lights blinking in patterns I didn't understand. I scanned the room for the bearded man, but he was nowhere to be seen. The space was huge, with walkways and platforms connecting different levels of machinery. Steam hissed from various pipes, and the floor vibrated under my feet from the massive engines. That's when I saw Jeremy. He was standing near the main engine assembly, about 30 feet away from me. His back was to me, and he wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, while the engines roared around him. Something about his posture looked wrong, too rigid, like he was frozen in place. "Jeremy!" I shouted over the noise, but he didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I moved closer, weaving between the machinery and support beams. The heat was intense this close to the engines, and sweat was already beading on my forehead. Jeremy still hadn't moved. "Jeremy!" I called again when I was about 10 feet away. Still nothing. I walked around to face him, and what I saw made my stomach drop. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything. He was staring straight ahead with a blank expression, like he was sleepwalking. His mouth was slightly open, and he was swaying just a little bit, barely noticeable movements that made him look like he was floating. "Jeremy, what's wrong?" I reached out toward his shoulder, but stopped just short of touching him. Something about this felt dangerous, like I might break whatever spell he was under. His eyes didn't track my movement at all. It was like I wasn't even there. He just kept staring at nothing, swaying slightly on his feet. The engines thundered around us, but Jeremy seemed completely oblivious to the noise. I waved my hand in front of his face. No reaction. I snapped my fingers near his ear. Nothing. Whatever had happened to him, he was completely gone, trapped in some kind of trance that I couldn't break through. The bearded man had led me here, led me directly to Jeremy. But why? What was the connection between that thing and my friend standing here like a zombie? I looked around the engine room again, searching for any sign of the figure, but the space was empty except for the two of us. The massive machinery continued its relentless operation, filling the air with heat and noise and vibration. Jeremy remained motionless beside the main engine, his vacant stare fixed on something I couldn't see. I moved closer to Jeremy, my bare feet silent on the metal floor. The engine noise was so loud I had to lean in to get his attention. Something was wrong with the way he stood there, too still, too rigid, like he wasn't really seeing what was in front of him. "Jeremy," I called out again, but he didn't turn around, didn't even twitch. I reached out to touch his shoulder, my hand just inches away from the fabric of his work coveralls. The moment my fingers made contact with his shoulder, everything went wrong. Jeremy's body went completely limp. His knees buckled and he started falling forward, straight toward the massive engine assembly. The main drive shaft was spinning at full speed, and there were exposed gears and pistons moving in a deadly rhythm just 3 feet in front of where he'd been standing. "No!" I lunged forward, trying to grab him before he fell into the machinery. My hand caught nothing but air as Jeremy's body pitched forward like a rag doll. He hit the engine assembly with a sickening crunch. The spinning drive shaft caught his torso and pulled him in. I heard bones breaking over the roar of the engines. Blood sprayed across the metal housing as the machinery crushed and mangled his body. His work coveralls got caught in the gears, and the whole thing happened so fast I couldn't even process what I was seeing. Jeremy was dead. Instantly. Completely. I stood there for maybe 5 seconds, my brain refusing to accept what had just happened. Jeremy's body was twisted around the drive shaft, and blood was everywhere. The engines kept running like nothing had happened, grinding and churning with pieces of my best friend caught in the machinery. I snapped out of it and ran to the emergency controls. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely work the switches, but I managed to hit the main engine shutdown. The massive diesels started winding down with a deep groaning sound that seemed to go on forever. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and panicked in the stillness. I could hear the drip of hydraulic fluid and other things I didn't want to think about. I grabbed the emergency phone mounted on the wall next to the control panel. My fingers fumbled with the buttons as I dialed the main communications center. "This is Martinez in the engine room," I said when Thompson's voice came through the speaker. "We have an emergency. Jeremy's dead. I need everyone down here right now." "What happened?" Thompson's voice was sharp. "Accident with the main engine. Just get down here and call the surface. We need a rescue team." I hung up and looked back at the engine assembly. Jeremy's body was still there, still twisted in the machinery. I wanted to pull him out, but I knew better than to touch anything until the others arrived. The whole scene needed to be documented for the investigation that would follow. Within 10 minutes, I heard footsteps on the metal stairs. Thompson came down first, followed by Rodriguez and 2 other crew members whose names I couldn't remember in my current state. They all stopped when they saw the engine assembly. "Jesus Christ," Thompson muttered. He walked over to get a better look, then turned back to me. "What the hell happened?" "I found him down here," I said. "He was just standing there, not responding when I called his name. When I touched his shoulder, he collapsed forward into the machinery." Thompson nodded grimly and started taking photos with his phone. Rodriguez was already on his radio, contacting the surface crew to arrange for an emergency evacuation team. The other crew members stood back, looking sick. "We can't move him until the investigators get here," Thompson said. "This whole area is a crime scene now." Crime scene. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. They'd investigate this as a potential accident, maybe even negligence. They'd want to know why Jeremy was down here in the first place, why he was acting strange. why I followed him. How could I explain about the bearded man in the yellow rain jacket? How could I tell them Jeremy had been in some kind of trance, led down here by a figure that walked through solid doors? They'd think I was having a breakdown from the stress of working underwater. Rodriguez finished his radio call and walked over to where I was standing. Surface team is mobilizing now. They'll have a rescue crew down here in 6 hours. We need to secure this area and make sure nobody else comes down here. Thompson assigned 2 crew members to stand guard at the entrance to the engine room. The rest of us went back upstairs to wait for the rescue team. I sat in the mess hall with a cup of coffee. I couldn't drink, staring at my hands and trying to make sense of what had happened. Jeremy had been fine yesterday. We talked about the bearded man, reviewed the security footage together, shared our confusion about the whole situation. Now he was dead, crushed by machinery in a part of the rig he had no business being in. The bearded man had led him down there. I was sure of it now. Whatever that thing was, ghost, hallucination, or something else entirely, it had lured Jeremy to his death, and it had tried to do the same thing to me. I thought about Jeremy's blank expression, the way he'd stood there like he wasn't really present, like something else was controlling him. The bearded man had walked through that door like it wasn't even there, and somehow Jeremy had followed. The rescue team would arrive in a few hours. They'd investigate the accident, document everything, and eventually transport Jeremy's body to the surface. The rig would probably be shut down while they conducted their investigation, and I'd have to live with the knowledge that I'd watched my best friend die and couldn't do anything to stop it. I sat there in the mess hall, surrounded by the quiet hum of the rig systems, waiting for the rescue team to arrive, and knowing that nothing would ever be the same. I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at my hands. They wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jeremy's body hitting that engine assembly, heard the sound of bones breaking. The crew had sent me back to my quarters after giving my statement to Thompson, told me to rest while they handled the emergency procedures. Rest. Like that was even possible. The rescue team was still making their way down from the surface. 1,500 feet takes time, even with the best equipment. I'd heard Rodriguez on the radio earlier, coordinating with Topside. They were bringing a full medical team and investigators. Not that it mattered for Jeremy anymore. I kept replaying those final moments in the engine room. Jeremy standing there like a statue, completely unresponsive. When I touched his shoulder, he just collapsed forward into the machinery. But there was something else. Something I hadn't told Thompson or anyone else. Right before Jeremy fell, I could have sworn I heard him say something. The engine noise was so loud I almost missed it, but it sounded like David's here. Why would he say that? I was right behind him, but he hadn't acknowledged me at all when I called his name. It was like he was talking to someone else entirely. Someone who wasn't there. Or someone who was there, but I couldn't see them. I stood up and paced to the small porthole in my quarters. The water outside was black as ink, lit only by the rig's external lights. Somewhere up there, the rescue team was descending through all that darkness to reach us. I wondered what they'd make of Jeremy's death. Probably chalk it up to an accident. Maybe blame it on the stress of working underwater for months at a time. But I knew better now. The bearded man in the yellow rain jacket hadn't been some stress-induced hallucination. He'd been real, and somehow he'd gotten to Jeremy, led him down to that engine room in some kind of trance. The same way he'd tried to lead me that first night, standing at my door, dripping seawater onto the floor. I thought about all the stories the crew told about the captain, how he wandered the rig at night, how crew members would sometimes see him in the corridors. I'd always figured they were just ghost stories, the kind of thing people made up to pass time on long shifts. But what if they weren't made up? What if there really was something down here with us, something that had been here long before any of us arrived? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Jeremy hadn't been acting like himself in those final moments. He'd been moving like he was sleepwalking, following some invisible guide. And that thing I'd seen walk through the engine room door without opening it, that wasn't human. Couldn't be human. I sat back down on my bunk and checked the time. 3:47 in the morning. The rescue team wouldn't reach us for at least another hour, maybe 2. The rig felt different now, quieter somehow. The main engine was still shut down from when I'd hit the emergency controls, so the usual vibrations were gone. All I could hear was the hum of the backup generators and the distant sound of the crew working in other parts of the rig. My mind kept drifting back to Jeremy's last words. David's here. Had he been trying to warn me about something? Or had he been talking to the bearded man, telling him I was nearby? The thought made my skin crawl. What if that thing had been using Jeremy to get to me somehow? I remembered how Jeremy had looked when I found him in the engine room. His eyes were open but completely blank, like he was seeing something that wasn't there. Or maybe he was seeing something that was there. Something I couldn't see until it was too late. The stories about the captain always mentioned how he'd appear to crew members right before accidents happened. How he'd be seen walking the corridors just before someone got hurt or equipment failed. I'd never paid much attention to those details before, but now they seemed important. What if the captain wasn't just a ghost story? What if he was some kind of warning, or worse, some kind of predator? I thought about the first night I'd seen him, how he'd stood at my door dripping seawater, how he'd walked away when I followed, leading me through the rig like he wanted me to go somewhere specific. I'd lost him that night, but maybe that was because I hadn't been ready yet. Maybe Jeremy had been more susceptible somehow, more willing to follow where the captain led. The idea terrified me. If this thing could control people, make them walk into dangerous situations, then none of us were safe. How many other accidents on deep-sea rigs had been blamed on human error when something else was really responsible? I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my quarters and tensed up. But these were normal footsteps, the heavy boots of crew members, not the wet squelching sound I'd heard the bearded man make. Someone knocked on my door. David? It's Thompson. You doing okay in there? I got up and opened the door. Thompson stood in the hallway, looking exhausted. His face was grim, and I could see the stress of the situation weighing on him. Yeah, I'm fine, I said, though we both knew that wasn't true. Rescue team's about an hour out, he said. They'll want to talk to you again when they get here, get a full statement about what happened. I nodded. I'll tell them everything I saw. Thompson studied my face for a moment. You sure you're okay? You look pretty shaken up. Wouldn't you be? I asked. I just watched my friend die. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess I would be. Look, I know this is hard, but try to get some rest if you can. It's going to be a long day once the investigators get here. After he left, I closed the door and leaned against it. I wanted to tell him about the captain, about what I really thought had happened to Jeremy. But how could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I tell him that I thought a ghost had led Jeremy to his death? I walked back to my bunk and lay down, staring at the ceiling. The rescue team would arrive soon, and they'd want answers. They'd want to know exactly what happened in that engine room, why Jeremy was there in the first place, how he'd ended up caught in the machinery. I'd have to give them a story that made sense, something they could put in their report. But the real story, the one about the bearded man in the yellow rain jacket who could walk through doors and lead people into trances, That story would have to stay with me, at least until I figured out what the captain really was and what he wanted. I closed my eyes and tried to push away the image of Jeremy's blank stare, the way he'd swayed slightly before collapsing. Whatever had happened to him, whatever that thing had done to him, I couldn't let it happen to anyone else. The crew deserved to know what they were really dealing with down here, even if they wouldn't believe me. The rig creaked around me, settling into its new rhythm without the main engine running. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the crew still working, preparing for the rescue team's arrival. But all I could think about was Jeremy's final moment, the way he'd said my name like he was trying to tell me something important. Maybe he had been trying to warn me. Maybe in those last few seconds before the captain took complete control, Jeremy had managed to get out one final message. A warning that I was next, that the bearded man wasn't done with the crew yet. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, knowing that sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight, and maybe not for a long time. Because now I knew the truth about the captain, and I knew that Jeremy's death was just the beginning. The knocking started again at 4:23 in the morning. I'd been lying there staring at the ceiling for hours, my mind replaying Jeremy's death over and over. The sound of his bones breaking, the way his body went limp when I touched his shoulder. I couldn't shake any of it. But this knocking was different from before. Slower, more deliberate. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Like someone was trying to get my attention without waking the whole rig. I stayed put on my bunk, pulling the thin blanket up to my chin. My heart was already racing, but I wasn't getting up this time. Not after what happened to Jeremy. Whatever was out there in that hallway, I wasn't going to give it the satisfaction of luring me out. The knocking stopped for maybe 30 seconds. Then it started again, louder this time. The metal door vibrated with each impact. "Go away," I whispered to myself, squeezing my eyes shut. But it didn't go away. The knocking got more insistent, faster. Bang, 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 pause, bang, bang, bang. Like whoever was out there was getting frustrated that I wasn't responding. Then I heard the footsteps. They started right outside my door, that same wet, squelching sound I'd heard before. The bearded man was pacing back and forth in the hallway, his waterlogged boots making that horrible noise with every step. Left to right to left, over and over again. I pulled the blanket over my head, but I could still hear everything. The pacing continued for what felt like 10 minutes, maybe longer. Sometimes he'd stop right in front of my door and the footsteps would pause. During those moments, the silence was almost worse than the noise. That's when I noticed the water. It started as just a thin line seeping under the door, barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. But it kept coming, spreading across the metal floor of my quarters. The smell hit me next. That thick, briny scent of seawater mixed with something else. Something rotten. I sat up in bed, watching the water creep toward my bunk. It wasn't just a little moisture anymore. There was enough water coming under that door to form actual puddles, just like I'd seen in the hallway before. The pacing stopped. I held my breath, listening. Nothing but the usual hum of the rigged systems and the distant sound of the backup generators. But I could feel something out there, waiting. Then came a different sound, a slow scraping, like fingernails dragging across metal. It started at the bottom of my door and worked its way up inch by inch. The sound made my teeth ache. I wanted to get up and check the door, make sure it was locked. But my body wouldn't move. Every instinct, I